It was 1945. The war was over. But for some of the most dangerous minds in human history, it was just beginning. A man in a white lab coat steps off a military transport in New Mexico. He is not in handcuffs. He is not on trial. He is handed a contract, a salary, and a brand new American name. Just months earlier, this same man was designing weapons for Adolf Hitler. Now, he is designing rockets for the United States government. Nobody tells the public. Nobody asks questions. And the man smiles. This is not fiction. This is one of the most carefully buried chapters of the 20th century. And once you understand what really happened to Nazi scientists after Germany fell, you will never look at the space race, modern medicine, or the Cold War the same way again. When the Allied forces swept through Germany in the final months of World War II, they were not just looking for survivors and war criminals. They were hunting something far more valuable. Knowledge. The kind of knowledge that could win the next war before it even started. Inside shattered laboratories, bombed-out factories, and underground bunkers they founded. Blueprints, formulas, and the men who created them. Germany in 1945 was the most scientifically advanced nation on Earth. That is a fact that makes most people deeply uncomfortable. The Nazi war machine had poured enormous resources into cutting-edge research. Jet engines, ballistic missiles, chemical weapons, nerve agents, aviation medicine, rocket propulsion systems so far ahead of anything the Allies had that American and Soviet engineers openly admitted they had no idea how to replicate them. The scientists who built these things were extraordinary. They were also complicit in one of history's greatest atrocities. And that is where the story gets complicated. On May 22nd, 1945, a German rocket engineer named Wernher von Braun walked calmly into American custody near the Austrian border. He was 33 years old. He had spent the last decade building the V-2 rocket, a weapon that rained death on London, Antwerp, and Paris. Thousands of civilians died because of his work. But von Braun was not carrying a white flag. He was carrying something far more powerful: the blueprints for the future of space travel. And the Americans knew it immediately. Von Braun had actually prepared for this moment. He had ordered his team to bury 14 tons of technical documents in a mine shaft in the Harz Mountains. He had arranged for his entire engineering team, over 100 specialists, to surrender together as a group to American forces rather than to the Soviets who were closing in from the east. This was not a desperate man fleeing justice. This was a calculated negotiation, and it worked. What followed was one of the most audacious and morally troubling operations in American intelligence history. It was called Operation Paperclip. The name came from the paper clips that were attached to the files of scientists deemed useful to the United States. Scientists who might otherwise have faced war crimes tribunals were instead given a second life, a clean identity, a future in America. The operation was officially authorized in September 1946 by President Harry Truman. But here is the twist that most history books skip over entirely. Truman had specifically ordered that anyone who was a member of the Nazi Party, or who had been more than a nominal participant in Nazi activities, was to be excluded. The directive was clear. The reality was something else entirely. Military and intelligence officers who ran Operation Paperclip began quietly altering documents. They scrubbed Nazi Party affiliations from personnel files. They buried evidence of war crimes. They rewrote biographies to make men who had used slave labor look like reluctant bystanders. The deception went all the way up the chain. And it worked because everyone involved convinced themselves that the Soviet threat justified anything. Anything at all. By 1955, over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians had been brought to the United States under this program. 1,600. They were placed in military research facilities across the country. Huntsville, Alabama. Dayton, Ohio. Fort Detrick, Maryland. They were given houses, salaries, security clearances, and eventually citizenship. And they got to work. Wernher von Braun became the most celebrated figure of the American space program. He ran the team that developed the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built by human hands. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in July 1969, the cameras cut to mission control, and the world saw the jubilant faces of NASA scientists weeping with joy. What the cameras did not linger on was the fact that many of the engineers who made that moment possible had, just 25 years earlier, been designing weapons for the Third Reich. The moon landing was real. The history behind it was complicated, but von Braun was only the beginning. Now here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody knows. While America was running Operation Paperclip, the Soviets were running their own version. They called it Operation Paperclip. And on the night of October 22nd, 1946, in a single coordinated action across the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, Soviet agents rounded up approximately 2,000 German scientists and their families. In the middle of the night, with almost no warning, they were loaded onto trains and transported deep into the Soviet Union. Some went willingly, seduced by promises of resources and recognition. Others had no choice at all. Either way, they disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. These German minds fed directly into the Soviet rocket program. They worked alongside Sergei Korolev, the mysterious chief designer whose name was kept so secret that even Soviet newspapers could not print it. The early Soviet rockets that shocked the world, including the R-7 that launched Sputnik in 1957 and sent Yuri Gagarin into orbit in 1961, were built on a foundation that owed something to German engineering. Both superpowers were racing to the stars, and both were standing on the shoulders of men who had served Hitler. But the rocket scientists were not the only ones absorbed into the post-war world. The medical researchers were too, and this is the darkest chapter of all. At the Nuremberg Doctors Trial in 1946 and 1947, 23 Nazi physicians stood in the dock. They had conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners without consent. Freezing experiments, high-altitude experiments, infectious disease experiments. Experiments so brutal that they defy description. 7 were hanged. 9 received prison sentences. But others never faced trial at all. Kurt Blom was one of Germany's leading biological weapons researchers. He had overseen experiments on prisoners at Dachau and had worked on plague research for the Nazi government. He was acquitted at Nuremberg due to lack of direct evidence. Within months of his acquittal, he was being interviewed by American military intelligence. By 1951, he was working for the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. The files on exactly what he contributed were classified for decades. Hubertus Strughold was called the father of space medicine. His research on how the human body responds to extreme altitude and oxygen deprivation became foundational to American astronaut training. He was celebrated. He received awards. A library at the USAF School of Aerospace Medicine was named after him. Then, in the 1980s, researchers digging through declassified documents discovered that Strughold's name appeared in files related to experiments conducted at Dachau. Experiments on living prisoners. The library was quietly renamed. But Strughold himself had died in 1986, having lived a full American life, honor to the end. These men did not escape justice through chaos or oversight. They escaped because powerful institutions decided their knowledge was worth more than accountability. That calculation haunts us still. And now the final twist, the one that reframes everything. In 1974, a journalist named Linda Hunt began filing Freedom of Information Act requests to uncover the true scope of Operation Paperclip. She spent years piecing together what had actually happened, and her book published in 1991 blew open the story for the American public. What she found was not just that war criminals had been imported and protected. What she found was that the deception had been systematic, institutional, and deliberate. Senior officials in the State Department, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, and military intelligence had all knowingly falsified records. They had looked at files documenting Nazi party membership and SS affiliations and had stamped them anyway. Approved. Useful. Welcome to America. The people who made these decisions were not monsters. They were bureaucrats and generals who genuinely believed they were protecting their country from Soviet expansion. They believed the ends justified the means. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is that on a purely strategic level, they were not entirely wrong. The American missile program that deterred Soviet aggression, the space program that inspired a generation, the aerospace medicine that protected astronauts, these things were real. They mattered, and they were built, in part, by men whose hands are not clean. History does not give us the comfort of simple judgments. It gives us choices made under pressure by flawed people inside impossible systems. Von Braun died in 1977 in Alexandria, Virginia. He was 75 years old. He never stood trial. He was awarded the National Medal of Science by President Gerald Ford. To the end, he maintained that he had simply been a scientist following his passion for the stars, constrained by the political reality around him. Whether you believe that depends on how much weight you give to the 15,000 concentration camp prisoners who died building the V-2 rockets he designed at the Middlework underground factory. Most of them were worked to death. Von Braun visited that factory. He saw what he saw. The last living survivors of those camps died decades ago, carrying memories that never made headlines. No library was named for them. No medal was struck in their honor. They do not have craters on the moon named after them, as Von Braun does. They are in the archive, filed away, waiting for someone to look. Operation Paperclip was officially declassified in the 1990s. The full scope of what happened is now, technically, a matter of public record. And yet most people have never heard of it. It is not taught in schools. It does not appear in the triumphant narratives we tell about the space race or the Cold War, because acknowledging it fully would require us to sit with something deeply uncomfortable. The idea that progress and atrocity can share the same origin. That the technology which carried human beings to the moon was conceived in the same era, in some cases by the same minds that conceived the gas chambers. History is not a story of heroes and villains moving in separate lanes. It is a collision of forces, decisions, and consequences that bleed into each other across decades. The rockets went up. The truth got buried. And somewhere between the launch pad and the lunar surface, we left something behind. The question is not whether we can separate the achievement from the crime. The question is whether we are brave enough to stop trying.